Well, it's been a very interesting winter so far. Once the weather got cold, I really didn't expect too much movement around this area, especially after the deer came through a few months back. I had to stop mentioning it around my guardian because she would just start shaking uncontrollably. Truth be told, I only bring it up when she starts to get a little too close and a little handsy, and I need to calm her down a bit. I would say something like, "Is that a green light out there?" as I'm looking out the window, or would talk about hunting. It doesn't matter if I was talking about snaring rabbits or something, she would still get worried. As a joke, I asked her if she would do the No Nut November challenge, which she started at the beginning of hunting season, and she seemed to get real mad at me. She yelled, "Of course I do that, though I never get past the third week." Confused, I asked her why, and the answer was obvious that I kicked myself a little bit for not realizing. You see, those that participate tend to let their imaginations run wild a bit. This will usually kick in during the second week, but the third week, most men are highly sexualized cultures, will hit their limit and have a naughty dream. For a succubus, this is a type of harvest time. She and others like her will sneak into a room around that time the dream begins to get erotic. At that point, they will begin to make their move. In fact, this is exactly what she was trying to do with my nephew the first time we met. If I hadn't woken up and stopped her, she would have taken the energy she wanted, and my nephew would have had been out of sorts, I guess you'd say, for a few days. Not from the energy drain. That's normal for a man after, intercourse. But the euphoria succubus leaves the man with. In such cases, it is possible to turn a good man into a sex addict, even if they're a virgin. When the third week came to pass, no pun intended, I didn't see much of her except when she showed up for the mornings and slept it off, thinking of it like drinking. If you have a beer once a week or a month, your tolerance will be low, so low that you will feel the effects in a single can. Now, with that in mind, think of the same tolerance as you go for a week long bender. We have all had to sleep off a long night before. Those succubi are lucky in the fact that they do not have to get the actual hangover, though they still have to sleep part of it off. Considering all this, it's a good thing she doesn't make true physical contact. At least how we understand it, of course. If she did, then she would be constantly pregnant and a petri dish of virus and bacteria. When I asked her about it, she said, "Every time I do this," and she teleported across the room, "all that stuff goes away and I'm as fresh as the day I was born." I was about to ask why she hesitated there, but I figured I would leave it. Over the winter, the weather had been rather weird. Though most people didn't know the half of it, there had been a lot more movements, too, from the other side. And since they must be using certain points to move freely, I've been able to see things that made my heart drop into my ass. In one such case, there was a winter storm that turned into a blizzard that came right across my area. Don't get me wrong, it's still cold now, but the weather has been weird. During the storm, I went out to get more firewood for the stove. With all this, we must save money nowadays, especially with inflation. While I was getting the wood, the wind and snow kicked up exceptionally hard, so much so that I was almost knocked off my feet a couple of times. On my way to get the final load of wood, the snow got so thick that I found myself thanking God for skiing goggles, or I would have been totally screwed. The wind kicked up so hard that I had to take a knee to keep from falling over at one point. When I finally got to the wood pile, the snow was so thick I couldn't even see the house, and it was less than 50 feet away, so I started to calculate the direction to get back. While I was doing that, I began to see things move in the snow. Something or some things that was not natural. Slowly looking around, I could see something moving through the air like a sheer silk sheet. Sheets wither with the snow moved all around me, making me turn left and right, trying to focus on whatever was moving around. I kept my hand on the wood pile as though it was an anchor. 2 steps away from it, and I would have been lost for sure. Not knowing what I was looking at, my mind wondered if there was a pack of predators around. This made me reach under my coat and drew my pistol. Placing my back against the woodpile, I continued to frantically look around in a vain attempt to see what was out there. You can call me paranoid, but I've seen and been through enough shit to realize you don't take this threat of danger for granted. As I got down on one knee, I positioned myself so that if a predator came, it would have to come at me from the front. That's when I heard it. The laughter. Slight laughing and chuckling coming from the storm. It was low at first. So low, I wasn't sure what I was hearing. Eventually, it got loud enough that I realized that it was a woman's voice coming from the endless curtain of white surrounding me. Confused at first, I listened closer, opening my mouth a little to allow my hearing to work just a little better. Then I lowered my pistol and yelled to the storm, "Come out now!" The laughter continued, and I could see movement much clearer. Tinted lenses definitely helped with this. I yelled again, "I said come out, where I can see you!" The wind picked up, and I could feel something brush against my arms and my head. I could almost feel it caressing my cheek as I stood there. "If you don't want to come out, I can make it hurt!" I yelled again into the solid white, which had gotten so thick I could barely see the black pistol in my hands. Another brush passed, this time getting under my winter clothing, causing a streak of cold to go through my body from my head to my feet. "Fine," I said as I started to pray. This time I used the Latin prayers that I had been studying. At first it laughed louder, but as I continued, it got a bit violent. It used the wind to force itself into me, knocking me back against the wood pile, but not stopping me from continuing my prayer. When I finished, I stated it again, but this time I yelled with all I had in my lungs into the ice-cold air entering my lungs with each breath. Reaching the end of the prayer, I could taste the blood in my throat as the frozen air had begun to tear at my vocal cords. When I finished the second prayer, I took a deep breath, feeling the cold begin to rupture my voice box. But I began again. This time, I didn't even get the first sentence out. The snow, the wind, it all just stopped. The world held perfectly still around me for a few moments before the snow began to all pull in one direction. I spun around to look at it as it was pulling together at the top of the stacked woodpile. I held my pistol tight as I had no idea what was going to come out of it. To my surprise, a figure formed, but it wasn't a disgusting monster. This was the shape of a beautiful Asian woman in a solid white kimono. Her skin was nearly as white as her clothes, and her long, flowing white silver hair flowed down close to her waist. She stood there for a moment, as the last of the snow combined to make her gracious appearance. It was then that she opened her eyes, those almond-shaped black eyes that seemed to shine in the daylight. All of this while the storm seemed to go around us, leaving us in a void of the snow with no snow. It was surprising. The snow was around us. The wind had shaped as though we were in the eye of a storm. I will admit that a shout of fear went down my spine as she looked down at me with those eyes. However, I didn't move. I simply asked, "Yokai?" To which she smiled and nodded slightly. Now, my Japanese language skills are so out of practice that I wouldn't even try anything beyond a single word. So I asked if she spoke English. She looked annoyed a bit and nodded again. So I asked, "Okay, cool. So you could come down here so we could talk, please?" She looked annoyed at first until I followed up again with, "Please?" The wind seemed to pick up as part of her body turned to snow. Then she seemed to float down next to me. Once she reformed herself, I asked her what she was doing on my land. "So you're not native to this area. How did you end up here?" I asked her. She spoke in a very thick accent about how forces are gathering and how she had been summoned. I thought back to that pack of werewolves and simply nodded my head, though I still didn't get a reason why she was on the wrong side of the Pacific Ocean. That is when I asked why she was bothering me. Then she responded, "I just wanted to play with you, feel your warmth." I told her, "You should have just knocked on my door. I have a fire going." She looked at me with the look of a mother has when a child asks her questions to something she should already know the answer to. I just tilted my head and told her that she was lucky I didn't start shooting and hit her. She looked at my pistol like a person driving a tank would look at a pellet gun. She couldn't tell, but I grinned a bit as I ejected the magazine and showed the bullets to her. "These are not your normal bullets, young lady," I said before she reached out and touched one with her finger. She pulled back like she had just been burned on her finger and looked at me with a bit of anger and fear. I calmed her down when I put the magazine back into the pistol and put the pistol back in the holster. When I looked back at her, she looked a bit confused that I had put my weapon away. When she asked me why I did not fear her, I told her I have dealt with creatures like her before. When I mentioned my guardian's name, she seemed to recognize it, and even seemed to be thinking of something else, almost playfully. I had to guess my guardian has been talking about me, or maybe they have a more personal experience. It was not long before something seemed to get her attention, which was in the same direction the wolves were going before. She apologized for needing to leave and seemed to take a very traditional Japanese decorum as she stood there with both hands in front of her and bowed. She looked a little confused that I didn't bow back. Instead, I reached out my hand. Slightly hesitant, she did the same, and I turned her hand and kissed her wrist. I figured I would feel cold even though that neoprene mask I was wearing, but there was no change at all. She almost seemed to blush at this. Before she left, I got her name, and she left me with a warning. There are others like me. Not all are pleasant to deal with. In truth, they would rather kill you and take your heat than play with you. I think one may be close behind me." I joked and said, "And what a nice behind it is," as I tilted my head, which seemed to make her blush again. And then she turned away. Her body broke apart into snow, and the void that we were in seemed to break as the weather hit me so hard I fell on my ass. Picking myself up, I remembered why I was out there in the first place. I got as much wood as I could carry and headed back to the house. On the way back, the snow once again got really thick. There was so much coming in so quick that I almost lost my bearings. As I reached the back deck, I could see I only had a few more feet to go before I got to the door, and that's when I heard it. The sounds of laughing, maniacal laughing, in the air was nearly transparent cloth moved in front of me. A bit annoyed, I called out, "Why did you come back?" When this phrase hit the wind, it picked up again, and I was having trouble attempting to walk. That is when something hit me. It hit me with enough force to knock me down, spilling the wood from my hands. Trying to shake off the hit, I reached out, moving my arms around, and found the bottom of the 4x8 post that held up the deck. Using it as a guide, since I couldn't see anything, I got to my feet. Leaning against the post, I looked out into the whiteout and noticed that my goggles were beginning to ice up. I only had about a minute before they would be totally covered, and I would be essentially blind. I tried in vain to wipe them off while beginning my prayer. The laughter turned into screaming that seemed to come from every direction at once. Thinking I was making it feel pain, I spoke up. I didn't see it coming, but the force of the hit would not let me miss that impact. Slamming into the post, I hit my back and my head and blurred my vision a little bit. I looked down and I could easily see a 5-foot long, 4-inch thick icicle that had skewered me and pinned me to the post. I would have screamed, but the hit to my head had torn my vocal cords and stopped me from uttering even a single sound. The void around me began to show, and a form began to build itself around me. Though a feminine form, this was no young lady. There was no clothing on this nearly white and hairless creature. Its arms seemed to hang far low for a humanoid of its size. Its hands were twisted into claws with more than 6 fingers each finger twisted into distorted talons, with more talons pointing the opposite way. The body was long and emaciated to the point that one could barely make out a feminine or masculine bone structure. Its skin hung off its body like someone who had lost over 700 pounds, leaving behind the emaciated form. Its legs were just as distorted as arms, with talons on the front and back side of its toes and heels. Even the knees seemed to have pointed bone coming from under the skin, aiming down. The body had no hair on it at all, but the worst part was the head. The head was shaped into a strange mask-like structure. Not a deer like a wendigo, but something much more demonic. 2 rows of shark teeth are shown across its lipless mouth, set up in a way that makes it look like it's smiling. A triangular, almost diamond-shaped head had sharp points coming out in random direction, and those eyes, those non-blinking black holes of eyes that seemed to look through me with the most hate and vitriol one can muster. This thing began to walk slowly to me, slightly stumbling on its distorted legs, as though it was trying to savor the moment. It got right up to me and slowly raised its misshapen arms. It pulled off my nearly frozen goggles and my hat with it. The cold air shot pain through my skull as it reached up and ripped off my frozen mask. With this, my head was fully exposed, and I looked at all the frozen spike through my torso, and then looked up to see its lifeless eyes looking at me. With what I could muster, I whispered out, "Why?" To this question, it paused and began to speak. I may not be able to speak Japanese worth a damn, but I can understand some of it. The bits I could understand were, "I'm going to kill you," "hurry," "more," "demon," and "fight." While it spoke, I was reaching into my belt. When I pulled out my pistol, it took a step back in motion for me not to shoot myself. I was confused, as it had already pierced me clean through. It then reached out with its hand and touched the side of my face and neck. Though I was cold before, but this was on another level. I could feel the heat being pulled out of my extremities and out via the touch it had on me. It seemed to give it a high of almost sheer pleasure. With that, my adrenaline kicked into overdrive as I raised the pistol, pushed the barrel against its chest, and fired 4 rounds into it. It immediately fell back screaming, with a mixture of a wounded bear, a stuck pig, an injured child, and a dying sheep. It staggered back and fell over as the special bullets I had burned into its body like magma. I watched for a moment as it kicked and screamed in pain, although this is all I could do since half of me was too cold to move, which is why I only got 4 shots off. After less than a minute, I could begin to move again, especially since the storm had suddenly calmed down to normal levels. With some movement of my legs, I got them working enough that I could break myself free from the post I was attached to. I put my pistol in my left hand so that I would be firing into the forest instead of into the house, and shot the end of the icicle. From there, I walked over to the creature as it was now barely moving. It looked so pathetic, laying there, unable to move. Many of its harsher features had begun to withdraw into a slightly more appealing form. The mask that covered the face didn't move as it spoke, but many of the more distinguishing traits had retreated. Looking down at it, I had to wonder if this was what it looked like before. It looked at the pistol confused, but I understand now why. So many of these creatures that jump from one side of the veil to the other forget the simple fact: when you enter the physical realm, you are susceptible to physical dangers, like weapons. For a lot of them, you must be specific on the types of weapons or spice them up a bit. However, it still matters. As I looked at it, I could feel the blood seeping into my clothes, so I didn't have a lot of time. Kneeling next to it, I began to give it last rites. Now, I'm not a priest or rabbi or anything like that, so I don't know if it worked. I still seemed to give it a sense of calm, though. It reached up and grabbed my hand as though it was trying to comfort me as well. I didn't feel good about what happened next. Placing the pistol under its jaw, it looked at me and gave me a nod. The sound of the echo through the air as my body jerked. Everything seemed to go in slow motion as the slide came back, ejecting the hot brass into the air. Immediately, I slid the pistol down to the torso and put one through its heart. With this, the body fell apart like fresh powdered snow. I want to say I was strong enough to just get up. I want to say I felt nothing. I want to say that I didn't stay there. I want to say I didn't scream to the heavens for a minute. I want to say I didn't curse myself at sending another to the other side. I want to say I didn't look at my pistol and think, maybe I should. What I will say is that I eventually got up and got inside. The icicle was already half melted by the time I got inside, and it was a good thing I had gone full prepper after my first run-in with the cryptid. I had plenty of quick clot on standby, along with all the other bandages I needed. However, I still called the paramedics. I had lost a lot of blood and couldn't drive, so no need to risk it. A day and a half later, I came home to a worried succubus in human form. Normally, I would give her hell for walking around the house bare-ass like she does, but I was just glad to be home. Plus, it was nice to have someone to come home to. It took me a week or so to be good enough to work outside, though skiing and snowboarding season is done early for me. But hey, maple syrup season is starting. I just have to wonder one thing as I get ready to tap the trees. Can I get through the season without any more weird things happening?